Authentication is complicated. So is the context API and React for that matter. Let's talk about the fundamentals of adding authentication into a Next.js project, and let's see if ChatGPT can help us write some of the code. What's up, everyone? My name is James Quick, and I do weekly videos on web development related topics. I spend a lot of time with React and one of my favorite frameworks, which is Next.js. But things always get more complicated in any framework when you start to add authentication. So since I've been working on incorporating authentication into a demo that I'll show you in a few minutes that you'll definitely want to check out, I figured this would be a good opportunity to show you how to incorporate authentication into Next.js using the context API and a backend as a service platform, which is AppWrite. AppWrite is actually the sponsor of this video, and we'll get to see more about them in the hands-on portion. In short, though, AppWrite is a backend as a service that takes care of all of your needs for your database, for real-time updates, and specifically authentication, which is what we're going to be leveraging in this video. In the meantime, let's go ahead and dive into some of the code that we're going to start with. So I've got a relatively basic Next.js project, and I set it up with Tailwind CSS. Actually, when you create a new project in Next.js now, they have a config option to set it up with Tailwind, which is really nice. So I've got some basic styling in here, and I've basically got two pages. I've got an index page, which is the home route, and then I've got a private page, which we will be gatekeeping in a minute, meaning if someone tries to come to this page and they're not logged in, we will redirect them to a login page or something like that, for example. So we've got these two different pages, and we've got this basic display up here just for demo purposes. So we've got a nav bar up here to go from the home page, which is public, to the private page. We want to incorporate authentication into this project. Now, how are we going to do this? We're going to use the context API. So I've got a blank user.ts hook, which is going to create a React hook and a context using the context API. So we want to do a few things in here. We want to have functions for the user to log in, log out, and sign up. So we want to have those functions. We also want to track the user across different pages. So we want to track user status, for example, whether or not they are logged in. We also want to track a loading state while we are determining if the user is logged in. And this is going to be an important distinction in this video. There's lots of different ways to handle authentication. I'm going to show you one, which is doing all of the authentication on the client side. In Next.js, you have the ability to do server-side authentication as well. There's benefits to that. In this case, we're specifically doing authentication on the front end. There are other ways to do it, but this is how we're going to do it in this video. And then the last thing we want to do is be able to leverage these things to be able to conditionally allow users to go to certain pages or gatekeep pages, and then conditionally show and hide things. So for example, inside of the nav bar, we want to, let's just add a comment in here, conditionally hide the private page link if the user is not logged in. Notice that GitHub Copilot is helping me with some intelligence there. And there's also one additional piece to this that we don't want to miss. Even if we hide the link to this page, we want to make sure if someone types this URL directly into their browser, we still prevent them from getting to that page. So we'll cover all of that hands-on as we create our context. So before we get started, I wanted to share with you a giveaway for this video. So I created this project, JQQ Memes, which uses AppWrite, Cloudinary, Next.js, and is hosted on Vercel. So it does a lot of the same stuff that we're going to talk about in this video. And what you can do is actually create a meme with a funny image of me. So it pulls a random image of me, and you can say, I love JavaScript for this one because it's happy, and I create this meme. You can download this, so it'll open it up where you can right click and download, etc. And so AppWrite has agreed to give away 5 t-shirts to the most entertaining memes that people create. So you can create a meme, and then you could tweet this. So you could come to Twitter and use the hashtag. It includes the hashtag JQQ memes. You can do that on Twitter, or if you generate the meme and then click on Twitter and then want to get this URL out of the tweet, you can copy and paste that into the comments below. So we'll give about 4 or 5 days for people to submit their memes, leave them in the comments below, or post on Twitter with the hashtag JQQ memes. We'll choose 5 of those and send out t-shirts for AppWrite to the winners. So let's talk really quickly about why we're going to use the context API in React in relation to authentication in this case. So in our application, we want to have basically a global piece of state that keeps track of the things that we talked about earlier, a loading state and whether or not the user is logged in and the actual user themselves. So in React, there's a pretty consistent problem that people come across, which is prop drilling. And they even reference this in the docs when you go to the context page inside of the docs with React docs. And they are pretty amazing. This is like the new React docs, which you should totally check out. But inside of here, they specifically reference the word prop drilling. And this is the idea of from a parent, you need to send a prop down to a component, to a nested component, to another nested component. So you're drilling kind of that prop all the way down the chain. In our case, we really want every component and page, any component that we write to have access to the user and that loading state. So in this case, we want to have kind of like a high level store that we can access and reference that data inside of our different components. In that case, in React, we can use the context API to do just that, where we can share that state globally or to a specific subsection of components. Basically, any nested child can access this state. And in our case, we're going to have this globally available. So that's why we're going to use the context API in this case. Let's head over to ChatGPT and see if it can help create some boilerplate code to get us started. All right, so I've got open a new tab with ChatGPT. You can find this at chat.openai.com. You can do all of this stuff for free, so you can follow along and do exactly what I'm doing. So in this case, what I want to do is ask ChatGPT to generate a hook for us where we can access the different pieces of data that we've talked about so far that uses the context API. So let's go ahead and ask ChatGPT to do this. Can you generate React code that creates a user hook that uses the context API and exposes the following properties: the logged in user and a loading Boolean. All right, so let's go ahead and ask that and see what we get. So here's the example, and then we can kind of walk through this. So this is where there's kind of some boilerplate code in here that I think is relatively annoying to set up. So let's actually look at what we have as it's generated in this code. So to create a context in React, we call the create context function. So this is going to create this user context. But then to be able to have this stuff be available inside of our application, we have to create a provider. So this is this user provider. And notice it uses use state in here to keep track of the two things that we want to keep track of, the user and the set loading state. So in this case on use effect, it's going to try to load the user as soon as the page loads. So it's going to make in this case, an arbitrary request to an API/user. It's going to get that response. It's going to update the user and then the loading property. Now in this case, it then uses that provider to pass in a value of user and loading. So it's an object that has two properties, which is user and loading. Now, as you wrap your application with this context provider, that means that these values are going to be accessible inside of any nested component. We'll talk about this more in a second. The way we access that is by creating this useUser hook. So this is this last part where we export this hook, which uses the context of user context. Now, to then reference that, we again wrap our application in user provider, and then inside of any different page that we want to access the user and the loading state, we can use the useUser hook that we created. So that's the basics of how this works. Now, the other thing I want to have though is can you also add 3 functions that can be referenced in the useUser hook for login, logout, and sign up. So this should go back and just kind of give us an updated version of the code for those different things. So you see we have the same provider stuff. We have the same fetch user, which we're going to have to update, but then it stubs out a login and then a logout function, as well as sign up as well. So it should all be the same. And then it should add those properties to the value here that exposes those properties for us in the rest of our application. So if you look inside of the value, you see user, you see loading, and then now you see login, logout, and sign up, which is pretty neat. Now it even is stubbing out some components for us to handle or to do login and sign up and log out. So it even has like these components built for us as well. Now this actually stopped kind of in the middle with a few lines to go, so I had to do a continue in here for this to finish. But here's one of the cool things is we can actually go ahead and reference the sign up, logout, and login functionality. So I'm gonna go ahead and copy this entire snippet, and we'll just throw this inside of the index page for our application. So let's go and just paste this in. This is going to look a little ugly for a second, and we need to add the little bit of extra code in here. So let's go and finish this and finish like this. That should be okay. All right, so we have sign up, log out, and log in, and then we need to move these imports to the top. Now this useUser, this is actually going to come from the file that we haven't added code to yet because we're going to update it, which is why we're not doing this yet. But this will come from .. and then we'll have hooks, and then we'll have user. So that's where it's going to come from. It should be throwing an error because we're not actually using that yet. I think that should be it, but we'll come back to that in a second. So we have our login. We have inside of here, we have basic use state for email and password, and then we call that login function, okay? Then we have our logout function. So this is just a button and it calls logout from the hook. Again, we can access this stuff anywhere. And then we have our sign up, which basically does the same as our login. So that all looks pretty good. Now, the only thing we want to do is update this to use the AppWrite SDK. So we haven't gotten into AppWrite. We'll go and set this up here in a second. But let's say, can you update the login? Let's say, can you update these functions to use the AppWrite SDK for authentication? Now, we haven't actually gone to AppWrite documentation or anything like that. This is just kind of going to do a lot of that stuff for us. So you see here, it's including the AppWrite SDK. So the first thing we would do is just go ahead and install AppWrite. So you run an install of AppWrite and you'll have that available. Now, inside of this use effect, now it has the check user function, which references the appwrite.account.get. So this is using, if we go to AppWrite, NPM, for example, so the AppWrite package on NPM, if we look for authentication or account, there we go. So account, this is where all the authentication stuff takes place. So this is the thing that we're going to use to reference from AppWrite to handle login, logout, etc. All right, so let's go back to this example code. So we have the check user. Again, it's doing the same concept of what we did before, but now it's just checking to see if this user is logged in. All right, so then it's destructuring these properties and then setting them inside of the user. Great, we want to check that. That's great. So we do this on the initial load of the application. Then we have our login function, which calls create session with the email and password. Then we have logout, which deletes the session, sets the user to null, and then we have sign up, which again basically does the equivalent of what we did before. And then we have our functions that are exposed to us through this useUser hook. So let's go ahead and copy this snippet because this looks good, and let's take it into the user hook and let's just paste it in. All right, so this is importing AppWrite from a local file. So I actually created inside of here a utils with an AppWrite file. So what this does is go ahead and configure the AppWrite SDK by creating a new client. It's going to check for a variable that references the project ID that we need to go and create or set up. So we'll do that in a second. Then it exports this account thing. So instead of referencing AppWrite.account, let's do a global replace for that. So let's just set this to account. So I did on mine, it's Command H to do a global replace, and then Command Enter is going to replace all those. And let's see if we can get IntelliSense now to do this import. So now we have the import for our account from our utils file there. So we can get rid of the original import. I think this is just a TypeScript error, so we could just label this as any to kind of move past this. In my source code, or maybe not, let's see. Oh, this needs to be children, any. So in my code, I actually use like real TypeScript, so don't get mad at me for this. Let's see what's wrong with the ID here. And this is another TypeScript error. So we could say that this state is going to be null or an object that has ID, email, and name. And each of these will have a type of string. So that should just give the types in here. Again, not the best TypeScript, just kind of showing how this stuff would work. So we have the use effect. Now we can add our TypeScript in here for email and password. So those are going to be strings. All right, and now we get to some of the point where we need to double check some of the stuff that ChatGPT is doing. because this is saying there is no create session. And if we go back and get IntelliSense, there is a create email session, which does take an email and a password. And then we're kind of confusing when we're referencing things in here. So since we have an email property here, but then destructure one here, it kind of gets messed up. So we can actually use the original email. So that login stuff should be working. Logout looks like it's working okay. We just call delete session. And then we'll have, inside of signup, we'll have 3 strings. So say string, string, and string for these 3 different properties. It'll go ahead and create that session. Now, if you look in here, we've got kind of a mess of red squigglies. That's actually because I named this file originally user.ts instead of tsx, which is what we need for a React component. And the last problem we have in here is a TypeScript issue. Again, we could have gone back to ChatGPT and asked it to add TypeScript typings. I'm actually going to paste in a snippet in here, which will update the TypeScript typings in a way that will work. So what this does is it defines an interface for the state of the user, which includes the properties we've already talked about: user, loading, logout, login, and sign up. Then on create context, we tell it it's going to have the context of user state, and we give it a default state in here. And then we actually update that with the values that are defined down here. So that should work well. And then inside of our index TSX file, now all of this code should be working. So we import the login from the useUser hook. We import the logout, and we import the sign up. So let's go and add all of these to our homepage. So inside of our index, again, we wouldn't usually co-locate these, but we'll just do it in this case because it's going to be a little easier to see. So we'll add the login, we'll add the log out, and that should probably come after sign up. So let's have each of these, and then in between them, let's have just a little bit of margin bottom. So let's do a div with an MB margin bottom of 10. Let's add one here, and then let's add one after each of these. All right, so that should at least show these different components. So let's go ahead and run this. And this should actually fail because, as we try to load this, because we haven't actually included the AppWrite project ID. So to be able to test all this stuff out, we need to actually use AppWrite for this. So we're going to go to cloud.appwrite.io. And inside of here, this is their cloud hosting for their backend as a service, which is really, really nice. So let's create a new project in here, and let's call this Next.js auth. And it's going to create a project ID for us. That's the one thing we need, because basically all the other stuff is going to be set up for us. So let's go into settings and let's grab the project ID. So in this case, if we look inside of the AppWrite utils file, it's referencing an environment variable called next public AppWrite project ID. So let's create an environment variable .env.local. And actually this should be at the root of our directory. Let's paste in that key of next public AppWrite project ID, and then paste in that project ID. Now this is a public thing, as you could probably guess, and that's because the protection in this stuff really comes from authentication, of accessing things in the database and that sort of stuff, which we're not going to get to in this case. All right, so let's go ahead and try to run this now, and we'll still actually have a failure, and we'll explain why. So if we come over to localhost 3000, we'll see that this is going to fail, and that's because it can't destructure property login of blah, blah, blah as it's null. So this actually comes down to the fact that we forgot to add or reference the provider inside of the app TSX. So basically wrapping this entire page inside of our provider. So in this case, we want to grab a reference to the user provider, and we want to just wrap this entire thing with the user provider. Now, what this means is everything inside of, or nested inside of, this user provider component, which includes our entire application, should have access to those properties. So this looks really ugly, and let's just kind of ignore that for now. But let's maybe look inside of, make sure we don't have any errors. Let's go to console here, and notice it actually shows an error, which is 401. That's because the user is not logged in at this point. And that's actually correct, because remember, we do a first check to see if the user is logged in on initial page load. So for that to return a 401 means they're not logged in. So that's actually correct. Now, this looks worse than I thought. So I've added some basic styles now where we should at least be able to have a better view of the form. So you can see this here. All right, so let's go ahead and give this a shot. So I'll use my email here. And then password will be I love JavaScript, obviously. And I think we're going to get an error and it's saying invalid user ID. So we actually want to call a different function in here. So we want to call, or actually the same function, but the first parameter is the ID for the user. So if we hover on create, this says user ID. So in this case, we can tell it to generate a unique ID for us to go ahead and create that account. So that should work now. And then we could call the login function and pass in the email and password. Now, when we call the login function, that will then set the user. So then we'll have access to that user. So we don't actually need to get the session here specifically. We could just call account.create like we had. So let's try this again. Let's type in James and our email and I love JavaScript. Go ahead and sign up. I don't think we'll see anything inside of our log, although we do get a warning here that it's using local storage for session management, which is okay at this point. So we don't have any resets on the form. We don't have any navigation on the form or anything. But let's see if we can now start to show and hide some content. So what we're going to do is scroll back up to inside of our index page. Let's actually use the useUser hook. So if we get IntelliSense in here, it's already got the import. And from this, we can destructure the loading property and the user property from our useUser hook. Now, what are we going to do in this case? Maybe we could say like if loading and a loading piece of text. Obviously, you make this a much better UI in the future. And then we can say if there is the user, if the user is logged in, if there is a user, we will show the logout. And we should also say like this is not loading. And we could also like short circuit this a little bit to say if loading, then we want to return our loading piece up here. So just kind of reorganizing this a little bit. So we'll return that component. Then by the time we get down to these other pieces, we can just check on the user. So we know it's not loading, meaning if there is a user, we'll show the logout button. And then if there's not a user, then we will show, we'll have to wrap these in empty brackets, but then we should be able to move these around, log in and sign up. So hopefully now we should be able to tell that we're logged in because we only see the logout button. Also conditionally, well, let's actually show this. So let's log out. Okay, so that actually switches. So we're able to track that and it kind of re-updates itself. Let's go ahead and log in again and do our famous password, I love JavaScript, and log in. And hopefully that will go through the same process. And now, again, the state gets updated for the user. And then let's go and do the same thing inside of our nav bar. So inside of our nav bar, the beauty of this hook is we can use this useUser hook. I'm going to get some autocomplete in there for the import. So make sure you import that if you're following along. But from useUser, I want to get the loading state and the user again. And we can do almost the exact same thing to say, like if not loading and user and then we'll take this down here and add our closing parentheses. So now we'll see that like we can see this private page, but if we log out, this link goes away. Great, we've done authentication. Our job is done, but not really, because what people can do is they can manually go and type in the /private route, and then they can get to the private page. So what we want to do here is have basically an interception inside football reference inside of this private page to check first whether the user is logged in. So if we go to private and we want to use our useUser hook, so we'll use useUser, we will import the same thing, so loading and user. And then basically on load, so we want to use a use effect. And actually it may be after the use effect because we want to be able to redirect based on any changes to the variables loading and user. So inside of here, we'll say if we're not loading and we don't have a user, then we want to send to the home page in this case. You could send to like an authenticated page, unauthenticated page, or login page or something like that. But let's do, I think we'll just use router in this case. And so from the router, we will be able to navigate. So we'll say router dot push, and then we'll push the user back home. So if either the loading state or the user state changes and you're on this page, we're going to be able to check if it's not loading and the user's not logged in, we don't want them to be here. So we can do that. I think this is looking for an extra dependency of the router. Fine. And that should be good. The other thing we probably want to do is something similar to what we had earlier. So if it's loading, we'll return another loading state. GitHub Copilot is just kind of writing this stuff for me, which is all fine by me. So on this page, there's going to be a little bit of time potentially if you go to that page directly where it's trying to figure out if the user is logged in, because that's an asynchronous process. So we're going to just show that loading state. And if they're not logged in, we're going to bump them back to the home page. So let's see what this looks like. Let's go to the home page. Notice we don't have that button to get to the private page. So it's hidden on the nav bar, which is great. But what if they do this? And so we'll probably see is that loading state. You saw that for just a second. It figured out the user is not logged in. It redirects them back. Now, just to verify all of this works, let's come back and type in I love JavaScript. Such a good password. And let's log in. And now our button should be here. We should be able to navigate back and forth between the public and private page. That stuff is working just as we expect. So it's really important to know that it's not just enough to hide nav links, for example. You also then have to specifically gate that page to prevent people from manually typing in the route that they want to go to. So I hope this was helpful. This was kind of a fun way for me to learn about authentication with AppWrite specifically, incorporate this into the context API because I needed this for the JQQ memes project. Then I wanted to see how much ChatGPT could do for us, which that actually did a lot. We actually obviously had to correct some of the things, but the majority of the code was kind of written for us, which is really nice. We also could have asked it more details to include TypeScript and all these things, but it worked out really well, I think. So jqqmemes.com, submit your memes, create a meme, share the link in the comments below, or just post the picture on Twitter with the hashtag JQQmemes. We will choose 5 winners of the coolest, most entertaining memes and send out AppWrite t-shirts, which are pretty sweet. So make sure to do that. Let me know if you have any other questions, throw those in the comments below. Hope you enjoyed the video and I'll catch you next time.